Life is made up of many gorgeous moments. Cherish them all, big and small, with Blue Nile. Whether it's for yourself or a loved one, Blue Nile's unrivaled selection of expertly crafted fine jewelry and statement pieces help make all your moments sparkle. Blue Nile's experts are on hand to guide you, and their diamond guarantee ensures you get the highest quality at the best price. Celebrate a life well lived in the most radiant way and save up to 30% at BlueNile.com. That's BlueNile.com.
Imagine a world-class graduate education that's accessible, flexible, and designed for career impact. That's Harvard Extension School. Build actionable knowledge and skills in challenging online classes taught by Harvard faculty and industry experts. Explore new opportunities and expand your network with high-achieving professionals from around the world. Part-time learning. Real-world impact. This is Harvard on your terms. Learn more at extension.harvard.edu/Spotify.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast.
You want to tell me what this is all about?
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew, as always, that's everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, as the title suggests, I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about production stories, marketing stories, development stories, release stories, all the ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I'm trying not to do snark. I'm trying not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation of just how hard it is to get a film off the ground. Each episode I try and cover 2 films, which is exactly what I've done now, and that is all the preamble you need. I'm going to take you back to 2017 for the first of the 2 movies I'm going to talk about. As always, I'm going to set it up with a clip from the trailer of the film in question. Come to the story, the other side of this.
The enemy tanks have stopped.
Why?
Why waste precious tanks when they can pick us off from the air like fish in a barrel?
There are 400,000 men on this beach.
He's coming back round. He's coming back round!
And that is a clip from the trailer of Christopher Nolan's movie Dunkirk from 2017, written and directed by Nolan, starring Fionn Whitehead, Tom Glyn-Carney, Jack Lowden, Harry Styles, Anna and Bernard, James Darcy, Barry Keoghan, Kenneth Branagh, Cillian Murphy, Mark Rylance and Tom Hardy in a mask. Dunkirk then, I mean, let's take the story right the way back to the mid-1990s for the purposes of the film. Obviously, a incredibly pivotal moment in World War II. For a young director by the name of Christopher Nolan and a young film producer by the name of Emma Thomas, in the mid-1990s, they were still in the midst of their debut feature film, the movie Following. They were a little way away from what would ultimately be their breakthrough movie, Memento. But during the point where they were making Following, they decided to take a crossing across the channel from the UK to Dunkirk in a small boat. It was a crossing that would stick in both of their minds, a very harrowing trip, although not to anywhere near the extent those during World War II endured, of course. But still, they just got a flavour and a taste of just how difficult and momentous that particular trip and that particular boat ride could be. Now, as Nolan explained to Tom Shawn in the excellent book The Nolan Variations, which I've leaned on a little bit for this podcast, he said, we were in our 20s, we hadn't researched it. He explained it wasn't a crazy thing to do. The person they were with had grown up sailing around the world, but he did say it was adventurous. He said, we were just a little early in the year. It was much colder and rougher than we were expecting. The channel was very rough and the crossing took much longer than it should have. Now, following at this point still needed to be finished, and so the immediate attention was onto that. And in fact, the journey to the Dunkirk film would take a lot longer, because the next necessary seed to it wouldn't be until 2014. But still, as Nolan explained to the Directors Guild of America, Dunkirk is in the DNA of my fellow Britons. He said, it's in our bones. Like all English people, I was raised on this story, the whole idea of the Dunkirk spirit. And he said, I quietly harboured for many years the desire to make a film on the subject, since it's one of the great stories in human history. It's also a war story that hasn't been directly told that often on film at all. In fact, you have to go to a 1958 film from Ealing Studios that was the actual only dramatic reconstruction in cinema. It was in 2014 then that Nolan took his family during a trip to London to the Churchill War Museum. And around the same time as well, Emma Thomas had given Christopher Nolan a copy of the book Forgotten Voices of Dunkirk by Joshua Levine. Now, Levine would be hired to be an advisor to the ultimate film Dunkirk. But what that book got across, certainly to Christopher Nolan, was the scale of how many people were on the beach and just the breadth of the individual stories contained on it. Nolan was thus very much moving towards developing this as a feature film. But if there was a slight eureka moment to it, it was on the harbour of Dunkirk, two long concrete breakwaters either side of the beach to give it some balance and some resistance. And effectively what Nolan saw in those they were two bridges that just stopped. There were two bridges to nowhere. And they'd survived the intense bombing during World War II. And it was the whole idea of a bridge to nowhere that would be the nub of his story. As he told Tom Shawn, he said that to me was the hook, because I'd never heard of the mole, and it's such a resonant primal image, and the mole being the name given to those breakwaters. And he just said people are literally queuing to know whether they're going to live or die. Then the bombers are coming, and a boat either will come or a boat won't come. And he was just taken with that. There was a story there he could really get into. He's still going back to when he first had the idea of doing something in and around the Dunkirk story. He did talk about how he wasn't quite ready. In fact, he would reflect on this to, I think it was the Hollywood Reporter, that it took me a long time to be ready to make this film, just as a craftsman. He said, I didn't want to take it on until I had a lot of experience directing large-scale action with the mechanics of the blockbuster under my belt. And so he would eventually turn to the film after making 3 Batman movies, perhaps pivotally 2014's Interstellar as well, which was on a dramatic scale. And also, I don't want to go heavily spoilery on Interstellar if you've not seen it. There is a moment that takes place in water where filming is, and well, let's just say a certain sequence is set in and around water. And so it was after Interstellar he turned his mind really to doing the Dunkirk story justice. So in terms of how to write it, he would talk about how he first had to work out, quote, a precise mathematical structure for the story before he began writing the screenplay. Because this time what he realised is he was going to be making less of a film about character and more about structure. More about plot, more about the events, that he wouldn't be, as he'd done a lot of time in his films, investigating and digging into the characters that he was presenting on screen. He was going to be looking through the eyes of the soldiers, reacting. I mean, he was going to drop us straight into the action as they responded to what was going on. That was the story that he wanted to tell. He wanted to put in the midst of it, therefore, fictional characters who would be inspired by, but not utterly based on, actual eyewitnesses, and a lot of research would go into this. I mean, once he decided this was a film he wanted to do, Nolan would speak to some of the surviving veterans of the Dunkirk evacuations. And even then, I mean, go back to that the Joshua Levine book I was just talking about before. again, talking to the veterans, he would find a huge mix of perspectives and attitudes. That here is this thing, here is this event in history that gave us the phrase, the Dunkirk spirit. But what Nolan found talking to the people who were actually there, who weren't just throwing that out as the cliche, that there was an awful lot more to it than perhaps had really been got across in popular culture at that point. Small little details he was digging into. I mean, there were 400,000 people on the beach waiting to be evacuated. And how do you go to the toilet? How do you get food and drink? And he was intrigued by these very, very human details. It's why there's a scene very early in the film of someone going to the toilet. He built that in. He also wanted to get across, if he was going to tackle this film, the idea of just how difficult everything was. The small things, a simple thing like getting on a boat, which in a lot of movies people get on a boat, but when you're getting on a tiny boat in very choppy waters and there's the threat of bombers behind you or above you, that's a lot more complex. And he wanted to get that small, I mean, it sounds terrifying to me, but that small level of detail entirely correct. As Tom Shon would write, again, going back to that excellent book, Dunkirk would be a compilation reel of last-minute getaways and narrow escapes. And in fact, as Nolan would tell Variety after the release, he always saw this too as a blockbuster story. And I mean, he said it's a strange term to use in relation to the subject matter, but we saw it as an entertainment, albeit one that's intense and suspenseful. He said we wanted it to reach the widest audience possible, and so we knew for that to happen had to be a summer blockbuster. He had to make a big, accessible summer blockbuster in an era defined by, I mean, there's no way around it, comic book movies, sequels, franchises. And here was Nolan going not for the first or last time against the grain, wanting to do something entirely different in a summer release window. He wanted a survival story, not a war film. But also, even though he was making what he saw as a summer blockbuster, he felt the burden of responsibility. This was the first time he directly told a true story on screen, and you know, such an important one as well, a very, very life and death one to the people who were on that beach, not all of whom, of course, came home. He felt that. He did feel the responsibility that went with it. He also, as part and parcel of tackling the true story, it was the idea that you don't depart from the human scale of storytelling. And he was talking about this to NPR. He says what he didn't want to do in the midst of this was cut away to a scene of generals in rooms pointing at maps and that kind of thing, or talking about politics or talking about history. His film was going to centre on the people on the beach, what they would have seen, what they would have experienced. And this is where he decided to give the film its very, very complex and yet wonderfully simple, I mean, paradoxically, I know, structure, that it would have 3 timelines that just converse seamlessly during the final cut of the movie. This would be an enormous challenge for the film's editor, Lee Smith. I will come to him a little bit later. But the whole idea of they're trying to escape by land, by sea and by air, and just weaving those together, even though the film takes place over the course of about a week, that he was conscious that the different escapes took different amounts of time, and he wanted to find a seamless way to weave that in. So he did this by dialing down on character, going for a bit more spectacle than he was originally thinking of, and he also knew that music was going to be really key to this. So, as he'd done with Interstellar, he brought composer Hans Zimmer in very, very early. Now, Zimmer's score had to work in tandem with the on-screen action. I mean, the beats and the ticks of Zimmer's score were crucial. And also, the score is ever present throughout the movie. This was going to be a really, really long score, ironically for Nolan's shortest blockbuster film. But it would take basically a year for Hans Zimmer to produce and crack the score and record it, after developing a lot of samples and doing quite a lot of build-up work to get to that point. But it would be a challenge and a half for him as well. Now, casting-wise, Nolan knew he needed a bit of a mix here, but he was determined not to make this with movie stars. He also didn't want the old cliche of 30-year-old actors playing teenagers. And this was something ultimately he would tell Warner Brothers when it came to pitching the film. He said, I wanted 18 and 19-year-olds because that's the truth of how we fight our wars. I didn't want to cast older people pretending to be younger people. And so it was going to be primarily unknown unknowns with some slightly more familiar actors. I mean, Tom Hardy had already worn a mask for a Christopher Nolan film before and agreed to do so again. Nolan knew that if he could ground this with some British actors of stature, he would be able to have a pretty much unknown main cast. So Kenneth Branagh, a key example, he's not in many scenes and he looks very cold wearing a very thick coat, but he knew having the stature of Branagh in there would lend the film a bit of gravitas. Likewise, Mark Rylance as well. He would bring Cillian Murphy in too, and then he found relative newcomers to flesh the rest of the cast out, including, certainly to acting, a man by the name of Harry Styles. I wonder where he came from. The casting work would be running from the autumn of 2015 through to the March of 2016. So a period where, I mean, he didn't actually officially have the money or the green light to make the film. I mean, it was pretty much a given that he was going to get it. But he was putting this together and he was developing it before he took it to Warner Brothers, which at that point was effectively the parent studio of Christopher Nolan's blockbuster films. That's where he'd been working out of at that point for the last 10, 15 years or so. But what he was doing before he took it through there, well, he went back to how he did Batman Begins. He got Nathan Crowley working away in his garage, just doing the design work, just putting the fragments of the film together. They'd also done location scouting as well. And I mean, they'd had an idea when they were first going to do the film of, we'll film this on the beach in Suffolk. We'll film it in the UK. It'll be slightly easier to get all your permits and get everything together. But then they went to visit Dunkirk, and Nolan, a stickler for authenticity and doing it right, knew that they had to shoot it on Dunkirk Beach. He knew if they were going to do this, they had to do it as authentically and properly as possible. This was an administrative nightmare. Getting the permits to do that was no mean feat whatsoever, and it would have been a lot easier to shoot the film in the UK. But again, this turned into something of a red line for Nolan, and if he was going to do it, it was going to be shot primarily on Dunkirk Beach. Warner Brothers then was presented, I mean, the pitch, as Emma Thomas said, was we told them we were going to do it for real without computer generated effects. There is CG in the film, but there is not a shot in the film that's entirely CG. Most of it, as we're going to talk about, was done practically. And she said, we told them we wanted to make a film about the evacuation that would really place the audience in the action. And again, with actors who you pretty much didn't know. Now, Nolan was asking for a production budget of around $100 million to do the film, and he wouldn't be taking a fee up front really for it either. That there were reports around the time that Nolan signed up and Warner Brothers signed up that he'd be paid $20 million to write and direct plus 20% of the gross to make the film. That would prove not to be correct. Nolan would take virtually nothing up front in favour of a back-end deal, but don't worry, he would end up very well remunerated for his work, and he wouldn't go without pot noodles for a little bit, so all was good there. Pre-production was underway in earnest in January 2016, and by May 2016 it was time to shoot the feature. It would go from Dunkirk to the Netherlands to the UK. It would do a couple of weeks in the US as well. And the shoot took place, as you would expect with Nolan, on very, very practical terms. He knew here that he wasn't putting a lot of dialogue in, and he wanted to throw people straight into the movie. I mean, during interviews for the release of Dunkirk, the film Saving Private Ryan from Steven Spielberg came up a couple of times, and in particular the opening sequence of Saving Private Ryan, where the audience is just thrown in with no explanation whatsoever, and it's a little bit hang on to your hats. He kind of wanted that kind of feel. He also said, I wanted the clearest, most real, most tactile sensibility for everything in the film, including the visual effects. And they talked about how, this was to NPR, he said, we sourced real planes, real boats. We shot in the real location. Several days, we found ourselves on the real beach watching the real little ships who'd actually taken part in the evacuation in 1940. He talked about how they came back to Dunkirk. We had a group of the same boats, and they came and took their part in our restaging of the evacuation. Now, the restaging itself was no mean feat to stage either. Not least that the mole, those bridges to nowhere, needed reworking. They needed rebuilding as well. It took nearly $1 million of Warner Brothers money, and again, an awful lot of permission to be able to restore them to the condition we see in the film. And as the Hollywood Reporter would know, actual vintage destroyers were hauled out of museums for the making of the film. The antique Spitfires were sent to the set in France. It got to the point where even the costumes were having vintage wool sewn into them, and there were 1,400 extras. There were for all we talk about the practicality of the ships and of the planes themselves, 1,400 costumes, right down to perfectly placed buttonholes on them, had to be produced for the film. And again, they were trying to use actual planes. They were trying to get across the sheer scale of it, even down to having so many people on the beach. And the obvious way to represent that would be to get these 1,400 extras and supplement them with an awful lot of computer generated work. Instead, they were using a lot of practical tricks there as well. They're using cardboard cutouts a lot to get across just how many people were on the beach scenes. Now, Nolan knew that this was going to be a leaner film than we'd become used to seeing from him. He was coming just off Interstellar, a film I like an awful lot. I wouldn't describe as lean. But he imposed rules on himself for the shooting of the film. This had to be, for instance, from the perspective of the soldiers on the beach. That was a key rule. So he wouldn't, as a result, show the German officers or the enemy in focus at any point. That was another one. In fact, he would go on to tell the Telegraph that I knew I didn't want to make a film that could be dismissed as old-fashioned, something that wasn't relevant to today's audiences. And what that ruled out for me immediately was getting bogged down in the politics of the situation. And that goes back to, we would not have generals in rooms pushing things around on maps. He says we don't see Churchill. That created a little bit of backlash at one point. We barely glimpse the enemy. Mark Rylance, a wonderful theatre actor and by this stage an Oscar-winning film actor as well. He also worked on a bunch of improvisations with actors, including Cillian Murphy, who were the civilians on the boat that was coming over from England. And they were coming up with moments and scenes that might actually happen between the stuff that was written down on paper. And as Nolan said, nobody knows rehearsal and improvisation better than Rylance, and watching him create this atmosphere was fun and deepened the characterizations. Now, a recent guest on this podcast was cinematographer Hoyte van Hoytema, and that episode is a couple of weeks back. It's in the archive. But we talked briefly about his work on Dunkirk, because this was shot on IMAX cameras, on large film cameras as well. Now, one of the reasons that this was slightly easier, I say easier like in deep inverted commas than it could have been, was that there wasn't a lot of dialogue. As such, I mean, IMAX cameras to shoot with are notoriously very noisy. By the time Van Hoytema and Nolan came to make Oppenheimer, they were shooting dialogue scenes with a lot of dialogue scenes, character stuff, close-up stuff with IMAX cameras. That is an enormous challenge, not least because the actors have to keep their concentration while the noise coming from these machines is ongoing. But for the purposes of this, it was mainly capturing the visuals that they would in the end have to go back and redo a lot of the sound anyway, which they knew they'd have to. But I mean, Hoyte van Hoytema told me about just the challenge of trying to get these sizable cameras in the cockpits of planes. In fact, I mean, they were having to modify and devise and come up with different cameras, different lenses, different ways of shooting things. That Van Hoytema would basically, who does metal work in his back garden anyway, so it sounds a bit busman's holiday to me, that he would come up with kind of like a snorkel-like lens to allow him to get certain shots that he wanted. They were working in very, very tight amounts of space as well. They were working with natural light too. I mean, Nolan wanted this to feel as authentic as possible. And then, I mean, going back to the space, I mean, if you've seen Dunkirk, you'll know that the Mark Rylance sequences take place in a really, really tiny boat that at best was meant for a handful of people. But I mean, it had to have not just the cast on that boat, but the necessary crew members to shoot the sequences required for it. And I mean, it would be fair to say it was a very, very tight squeeze, made triply difficult by the fact that this was on water as well. I mean, there's quite a lot of end-level, boss-level filmmaking going on here just to be able to do it. And Nolan would reflect on this. I mean, he just said it was almost like going back to independent film days, just this tiny splinter unit shooting all this stuff, and then a bomber would fly 10 feet over your head and you'd be looking at warships in the distance, all of which we were coordinating with the assistant directors. He said it was this weird contrast between the intimacy of the performances we were getting and this massive world we were building around them. He described it as one of the most extreme things I've ever done. Just to give a flavour of that physicality, I mean, nearly 60 real-life ships were used on top of all the small boats that we see as well. Every one of those ships had to be made to look authentic to 1940 standards as well, no matter what state they were in at that point. They had to be refitted, they had to be reworked, and they had to look right in the film. Real films had to be fitted with dual cockpits as well, because they needed camera operators in there. They needed the camera as well as the actors in there. And they needed room for Tom Hardy's mask too. And so this intense physical production that, I mean, the work that was done in Christopher Nolan's garage with Nathan Crowley clearly paid dividends, because, not for the first time, this film was shot remarkably quickly for what you get on screen. Now, more recently, Nolan, again, has made Oppenheimer, which was done in, about 60 days. Dunkirk took 68 days of production, and it's worth bearing in mind, again, large chunks of that on water, virtually all of it set outside as well, and a hugely challenging physical job. And then it goes into post-production, where editor Lee Smith comes in. Now, Lee Smith, and I recommend a podcast episode he did on the first season of the Team Deakins podcast, where he touches on working with Christopher Nolan. It's really, really worth digging out. But this would be, in fact, to date, this is the last time he's worked with Nolan, and it was such a challenging job. I don't think they've fallen out or anything. There's no tittle-tattle there. And to the point where he was starting to edit the film while shooting was underway. There's nothing unusual there. But again, the Hollywood Reporter talked about this a little bit, about how they had 54 hours of footage to sift through. And the challenge was making the timelines feel as seamless as possible. They had to redo the sound, re-record the sound from the film, because the stuff they got in camera was virtually all unusable. There's very little footage they captured in camera that they on the sound side that they were able to put into the film. And as Smith would explain, he said there were so many permutations of the movie. He said, I can't imagine how many I've got locked away. He talked about how every time you move something, it had a strong knock-on effect. You could slide it a little bit backwards and forward in the timeline. It was amazing what a difference it made to your emotional hit. Now, Nolan also gets his films finished in good time, but this meant the editing was going intensely through the autumn and winter of 2016. And his process was that roughly every week, they would have another cut of the film that would be shown to a very, very select group of friends who would give Nolan, legitimate, honest feedback on what they were seeing. That process led to lots and lots of cuts of the film, but eventually they got one. They got to a point they were happy with the final cut, which came in at a very, very lean 106 minutes. Then what happens is Nolan and his team refashion the film for every format it's going to be shown in. So there's more than one different way to frame an IMAX film. Nolan also works on making sure the version you see on your mobile phone, the version you see on your telly, the DVD, it all has to be right. And he signs off on the individual presentations of the movie. I saw Dunkirk twice in IMAX when it came out on two slightly different shaped IMAX screens, and it's remarkable just how the level of detail, just as to how slightly different those happen to look. Warner Brothers was building the film up as a big movie, as you would expect, for the summer of 2017, one where there was no shortage of competition as well. But ahead of the release of the film in July 2017, Nolan had one of his most nerve-wracking screenings, where he brought in veterans of the Dunkirk evacuation and veterans of World War II to watch the film, and he described how he never felt quite such a pressure in a professional setting as standing in front of that audience and about to show their version of what they'd actually lived through. Fortunately for him, the response to it was strong. And then when the film went in front of critics as well, there was almost universal praise for the film. I mean, pretty much rave reviews across the board. Some were talking about it being the very best of Christopher Nolan's work. Even the most begrudging review of the film acknowledged that for historical accuracies and little problems here and there, this was a really, really good piece of cinema. Not everybody loved all of it. However, the very least you were getting out of it was a deep admiration for what Nolan had managed to put on screen. He'd also put it on screen for, a quite modest budget, really, in the scheme of blockbuster cinema. One of the biggest movies of that summer that it was up against was Spider-Man Homecoming, which cost nearly twice as much. But when Dunkirk went into cinemas that weekend, let's look at the US box office, July the 21st to the 23rd of 2017, it opened with $50.5 million. First place for a World War II film without a Roman numeral in the title, that didn't necessarily scream movie star or the kind of thing you would expect big summer blockbuster. The number 2 film that week was also a big opener. The comedy Girls Trip opened to 31 million. So 2 big openers. Spider-Man Homecoming was on its 3rd week of release, already up to $250 million at the US box office at that point. War for the Planet of the Apes had been open a week as well, was just crossing $100 million. But there was another big blockbuster opening the same weekend, which was Luc Besson's Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets, which I will come to in a future episode of the podcast. That managed 17 million. That's 3 films opening over $15 million, of which Dunkirk topped them. The other films around at that point, Despicable Me 3 had been out for a month, was making lots of money. Baby Driver was doing well as well. The Big Sick, which I have covered before on this very podcast, The Big Sick was up to about 24 million after 5 weeks, but hanging around the top 10. Wonder Woman was 2 months into release, closing in on 400 million just in the US. And then there was the small independent release Wish Upon, which was rounding out the top 10. The following week there was competition from the Emoji Movie. I don't like to talk about films I don't like. I just can't avoid the fact, I've covered it before, the Emoji Movie is one of the worst films I've seen on a big screen. $24.5 million it opened to. Dunkirk's second weekend, it held over half its audience with 26.6 and topped the chart. Girls Trip was still around, but Atomic Blonde was the other big opener on Dunkirk's second weekend with 18 million, as well as Catherine Bigelow's Detroit had a small opening too that weekend. I really like Detroit as well. It's not talked about a lot. The Dark Tower opened up the week after. Dunkirk was holding there at second place, and it was Annabelle Creation that gave Warner Brothers its next hit by the middle of August. Dunkirk would still, though, sit around the top 5 of the box office until the back end of August, against not intense competition but enough competition. And by the time it left US cinemas, it had 188 million in the bank. It had 338 million outside of the US, a worldwide gross of $526 million. Not the biggest of Nolan's career, even at that point. However, that notwithstanding, $500 million for the kind of film it was really, really, really quite something. The film also interested the awards bodies a lot, and it earned Nolan a Best Picture, a Best Director nomination. Emma Thomas shared the Best Picture nomination with him as well. Hoyte van Hoytema's cinematography was nominated. Lee Smith's editing won. Richard King and Alex Gibson's sound editing won, and the sound mixing from Greg Landaker, Gary A. Razzo and Mark Weingarten also won Oscars. 3 Academy Awards in the end. Hans Zimmer was nominated, Nathan Crowley and Gary Fettis for the production design. They didn't win out. That particular Academy Awards, the 90th, the Best Picture winner was The Shape of Water, which I'm not going to grumble with at all because I adore The Shape of Water. Dunkirk ran things, I would suggest, really rather close. How do you follow up Dunkirk? Well, for Christopher Nolan, if the editing of Dunkirk was tricky, the film he'd tackle afterwards, Tenet, well, that was even harder. But I will be coming to Tenet in a future episode of the podcast. And now we're at the halfway point of this episode. So I'm just going to pause to do a couple of parish notices, if that's okay with you. First of all, if you like this podcast, there are a couple of ways you can support it outside of just listening to it. Thank you so much for listening to it. I really appreciate that. If you want to support it financially, if you go to patreon.com/Simon Brew, put some coins in the pot there, then you get the podcast early, you get it ad-free, you find out the gossip of what's going on behind the scenes, including on the Sylvester McCoy film at the moment, which I'm working my backside off. That I will be talking about that a lot more later in the year. Costing you absolutely nothing is to subscribe to this podcast at your podcast home of choice. That's massively appreciated. Really helps with algorithms. Algorithms are kicking the backside of independence right across the industry at the moment. Podcasts, filmmaking, websites, all sorts, and it really hurts. So anything you can do there is much appreciated. And ideally, if you could leave a hugely positive review, I can't tell you how much I appreciate stuff like that. I know lots of you have done it, and it does make a difference, and it helps us get noticed against, let's just say, quite a lot of celebrity-driven podcasts that seem to be coming into this space. All power to them, but I'd like to keep going too as well. I also have magazines, and I'm making a few more at the moment. I'm in the midst of production of issue 49 of Film Stories magazine, which is a couple of weeks away from release, and also the next issue of Film Junior magazine is edging close to release as well. Both of those I will be talking about in more detail in the next couple of weeks. You can find all of my print magazines. I love print magazines. Print film magazines, I mean, I cherish them. You can find those at store.filmstories.co.uk. But I think that's enough parish notices. I'm going to move on to the second of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode of Film Stories. And I'm going back to the mid-1990s for what turned out to be a little bit of an unlikely Don Simpson, Jerry Bruckheimer blockbuster hit. Let me play you a clip from the trailer. Come to the story, the other side of this.
As I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I take a look at my life and realize there's nothing left.
Who are those kids? Rejects from hell?
No. The kids with high IQs and low grades. All you gotta do is get their attention.
Once a Marine, always a Marine.
Most of my students don't even know what a verb is.
If you want to pass, all you have to do is try. Haven't seen you guys in a week. Thought maybe you got lost on your way to class. Wanted to help you find your way back.
You gotta be crazy to stay here and teach these program classes.
Why do you stay?
Why do I smoke? I'm crazy.
That then is a clip from the trailer of 1995's Dangerous Minds, directed by John N. Smith, screenplay credited to Ronald Bass and based on Luann Johnson's book My Posse Don't Do Homework, starring Michelle Pfeiffer, George Zunduza, Courtney B. Vance, Robin Bartlett, Wade Dominguez, Renoli Santiago, Beatrice Winde, Lorraine Toussaint, John Neville, quite a lot, and well, as we're going to talk about, not Andy Garcia. Now, acknowledging up front, this has been described in hindsight as the ultimate white saviour story, and there's little point pretending that elements of Dangerous Minds have aged particularly well. I'm going to bring in the voice from her own interviews of Luann Johnson on that just a little bit further down the line. I do think it's an interesting footnote in the cinema career of Uber producers Jerry Bruckheimer and Don Simpson. Now, this blockbuster pairing had given us like these huge, I mean, Flashdance was their big breakthrough film, but they were linked with the Top Guns, the Days of Thunders, these big bombastic blockbuster films. And by this stage in their career, I mean, they were just coming off the likes of Crimson Tide. Con Air was just making its way through, but Don Simpson was not a well man, was let's just say using his substances, I think is the fairest way to put it. And in fact, Dangerous Minds would be the last of the films that he was heavily involved with before he died of an overdose on his toilet. Just before he did go to that fateful trip to the bog, though, he was involved with jumping aboard the inspirational teacher movie bandwagon that at the point that the story first came in across his desk, had been reasonably recently mined for the hugely successful film Dead Poets Society starring Robin Williams. So the book that was the source of Dangerous Minds was from Luann Johnson, a former Marine who'd moved into teaching. She'd written My Posse Don't Do Homework. This had been relatively successful. It was published in 1992, and Simpson and Bruckheimer spotted the book in 1992 as well and got in touch with Johnson about adapting it for the screen. Now, she was still working as a teacher at this point, and she told Entertainment Weekly about what happened. She recalled how she was told, people say don't sell your book to Hollywood, they'll ruin it. But she said, after I met Simpson and Bruckheimer and they met the kids that she'd been teaching, she said, I trusted them. And once I decided to sell it, I thought, I'm not going to be one of those people who complains about every change. Now, that didn't mean she was going to be passive during the development of the film, but she sort of knew to a degree what she was getting into. So she signed the deal and signed up to be a technical advisor on the movie that over time would change its title to Dangerous Minds. Ronald Bass, a proficient screenwriter of the era, who worked with a fair few people on his scripts as well. There's a fair few articles around about Ronald Bass. He was drafted in to write the screenplay for the film. And Johnson reflected to The Guardian back in 2015 that at the point this was going through, she was asked who should play her. And so she suggested Bette Midler, and then she was told by the producers that Michelle Pfeiffer had read the script and liked it and wanted to do it. And as Bruckheimer said to Llewellyn Johnson, Michelle probably won't play it because she's too pretty to be a teacher, but I don't mean to insult you. And as Llewellyn Johnson said to Bruckheimer, I know you didn't, therefore I won't rip your lips off, although I've been trained to do that, former Marine. Ron Bass would question something that critics would ultimately pile in on. Was Michelle Pfeiffer too glamorous for the lead role? Llewellyn Johnson had a beautiful response to this to Entertainment Weekly. She just said, what, like teachers are ugly? And so Michelle Pfeiffer, at this point also, her production company was coming up. And so she got involved with the project and agreed to take the lead role in it. Now, Johnson talked about how she wouldn't, during the process of making the film, kowtow to Bruckheimer and Simpson, that she wouldn't treat them as Hollywood royalty or celebrities. And even when during the preparation for the film, they came to her classroom, bringing Michelle Pfeiffer along with them, she just wasn't playing the game. And she would just say, I think Bruckheimer and Don Simpson were insulted because I didn't know how famous they were. I don't think you need too many fingers to count just how many hoots she gave about that either. Now, the director of the film is a man called John N. Smith. He's not come up on this podcast before, and in truth, he's not likely to come up on it again. I mean, he'd made features and TV shows, but nothing really Hollywoody, and nothing that was particularly standing out in certainly in the realms of the kind of films that we talk about on this podcast. But in 1993, he made a television drama called The Boys of St. Vincent. Now, The Boys of St. Vincent was screened over 2 parts, and there's no easy way around this. It depicted the sexual violation of children in a Catholic orphanage. And that had become acclaimed. It had become his highest profile work to that point. And I read that John N. Smith was handpicked to direct Dangerous Minds by Jerry Bruckheimer and Don Simpson. Now, Simpson and Bruckheimer had formed for picking relatively inexperienced directors that often they found them in the world of advertising. You have a look at Con Air. Con Air was the directorial debut of Simon West. He'd come from advertising. He was happily picked for that. Michael Bay's background was advertising. He would end up directing The Rock, of course, and before that Bad Boys. And so right throughout their career, they looked where others weren't looking a lot of the time to try and find their directors. Now, John N. Smith did speak to The Guardian about the film, and his words, he said, I'd done a feature on black kids in Montreal and I felt that it needed that kind of edge. And The Guardian pushed back on him at that and said, well, what do you mean by edge? And he said, a more political point of view. He said, as something much tougher for a white middle-class teacher to confront kids who have in their normal daily lives all kinds of issues to face. When you happen to be walking through a park and there are cops there, you could end up in trouble. So John N. Smith's intentions were on the good side, I think, but as Llewellyn Johnson would point out, the changes were just not authentic to her classroom. And as much as she was broadly supportive of what needed to happen to turn her story into the movies, she would call out some of the let's just say more egregious alterations that were made to her story on the way to the big screen. As she said to Entertainment Weekly, around the time of its release, she said, the movie may not be factual, but it carries the same lesson as my book. You do have a choice. You can choose to learn. Michelle Pfeiffer then on board, and with Simpson and Bruckheimer, it could be set up with Disney money too. It was going to cost in the region of about $25 million to make the film, so a fairly modest movie, not least with a movie star at the heart of it. Michelle Pfeiffer was not going to open the film to like $80 million, but a very notable name, a brilliant actor, and prominent enough to get it noticed at the box office. And then, I mean, just to give it some box office security as well, Andy Garcia was signed up to play her love interest in the film. But then once they got those two stars in, the idea was bring in young performers without a great deal, if any, of acting experience. And John N. Smith was really keen about this. He talked about the honesty and the energy that the young performers that they hired for the film brought in as well. And so you had it anchored by two named stars, but the ultimate stars of the film would be the young actors who would be taking on the roles of the students at the school. Filming on Dangerous Minds would begin on February the 28th of 1994, and the film would shoot in California, primarily at Washington Middle School for its interior moments. That wasn't the actual school that Johnson taught at, that was Carmont High School. Carmont High School had been on the shortlist for the film. They got the flexibility and presumably the best deal off Washington Middle School, and so the high school stuff in the end was shot there. Luann Johnson, meanwhile, she would opt to only visit the set once because she saw very quickly how much of her story was being changed. And she explained this. She said, in my class, the kids were evenly mixed, black, white and Hispanic. In the movie, they made it all minority kids with a token white kid here and there. And she explained that perpetuates this myth that only minority kids are at risk and that white kids don't have any problems. There's also she realised in the film, a moment where there's a contest between, is this Dylan Thomas or Bob Dylan? That just never happened. Utter fiction. And I mean, she talked about how she used rap music in her teaching. That didn't quite make it into the film. And instead, they went the Bob Dylan route. And again, she called that out. She also called out the fate of one particular character. Now, this is a spoiler-free podcast. Let's just say the direction that one character in particular goes down, they didn't go down in real life, and she wasn't happy with that. She was annoyed with what they'd chosen to do to take it down a more cliched movie route. During the shoot as well, just in terms of the practicalities of the movie, it turned out Michelle Pfeiffer happened to be pregnant. And so the way she's shot in the film is taking that into account. If you watch the film, you'll notice there are moments where she's wearing, as was reported at the time, she was wearing long skirts, she's wearing baggy clothes to hide the fact that she happened to be pregnant. The production was very careful about what she wore and how she was shot in order to disguise the fact. But still, it was a shoot that went on for 2.5, 3 months. It wrapped up. In the end, I think the budget turned into $29 million, and the principal photography was done by May of 1994. Now, that didn't mean there wasn't reshoot work that needed to be done. There were indeed some pickup shots done at the start of 1995, but there was a fairly dramatic change to the film during the post-production of Dangerous Minds. It came as a result in the end of test screenings as well, and that was because there was a character in there originally being played by Andy Garcia. Now, Garcia was present in the version that was put in front of test audiences. It was a character brought in there to give a romantic aside to Michelle Pfeiffer's character in the movie. And as Luann Johnson had already said to the filmmakers when this idea was put to her, why does she have a boyfriend? She just said, if I'd had one, I wouldn't have been spending evenings with these kids. It was test audiences in the end that led to the demise of Andy Garcia's appearance in the film. And when test audiences just weren't impressed at all with just having the distraction character in there, Garcia's work would go entirely to the cutting room floor in the movie. He was chopped out of the film. The film was then promoted very heavily solely off the back of Michelle Pfeiffer with folded arms looking straight down the lens of the camera. Now, it's worth noting as well, I've teased it, I mean, you've heard snippets of it twice in this podcast already, but much of the cultural footprint of the film came not from the movie itself, but from its tie-in song. Now, this was recorded by Coolio, who we lost a couple of years ago, and the song Gangsta's Paradise was released just days before the film landed in US cinemas. This is one of those instances, I think, of a song that really pulled along the movie. Now, that's not to say that I think Dangerous Minds wouldn't have been a hit without it. But in much the same way, we got the Bryan Adams song, Everything I Do It For You. You get Wet, 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 Love Is All Around, attached to 4 Weddings and a Funeral. You get Whitney Houston singing I Will Always Love You, attached to The Bodyguard. When you get a song that's going nuclear, then it can certainly help just bring a few more ticket sales towards the movie. Gangsta's Paradise was a massive, massive hit song. And in fact, when Coolio died at the age of just 59 back in 2022, Michelle Pfeiffer said in her tribute to him that he was really one of the key reasons, if not the key reason, why their film saw so much success. It certainly wasn't the critical reviews that led to the film enjoying success. I mean, it was the reviews were calling it out fast. I said at the start about this is really just a straight down the line white saviour story. It was being called out to a degree at that point anyway about the stereotypes that were running right the way through the film, the racial stereotypes, the storytelling stereotypes, that it was just the triviality of it came up as well. And as much as Michelle Pfeiffer's performance and the character she was putting across, her depiction of Lou Anne Johnson that she was putting across was praised, and she was playing Lou Anne Johnson, the film around was just like, I mean, it was all right. It was, at best, it was coming across, it was all right. And so while Gangsta's Paradise was earning rave reviews and would go on to win a ton of awards, Dangerous Minds would, let's just say, slightly struggle. I will point out it did win a Blockbuster Entertainment Award for Favourite Actress for Michelle Pfeiffer some way down the line. The MTV Awards would note it as a Best Movie nomination as well. The critical response to it was really, really quite poor. But still, it's the audiences that decide, right? And on August the 11th, 1995, the film went into US cinemas. And Bruckheimer and Simpson, they had another hit on their hands. The film opened to $14.9 million for first place. This is mid-1990s movie when you've got a modest mid-budget costing film. That was seen as a very, very impressive result. In second place, also opening that weekend, was Keanu Reeves starring in A Walk in the Clouds. That opened to $9.5 million on its way to a $50 million worldwide gross. Dangerous Minds knocked Waterworld off the top of the chart. That was on week 3. There's the film Something to Talk About, starring Julia Roberts, Robert Duvall and Dennis Quaid. That was in 4th place. I mean, it opened relatively softly. Babe was in 5th on its second week of release, but Babe would hang around for a long, long time. Sandra Bullock in The Net was in 6th. Apollo 13 had been out for nearly 2 months. That was in 7th place. Virtuosity, there's an interesting film for you, not talked about an awful lot, with Denzel Washington and Russell Crowe. That was sat down in 8th. A Kid in King Arthur's Court from Walt Disney. Well, I just don't even remember it, to be honest. A live action movie that came and went very, very quickly. And Clueless rounded out the top 10 that particular week. What was interesting with Dangerous Minds, though, was it held so much of its audience. It dropped by only 32% in its second weekend, even as the first Mortal Kombat film came along and took the top spot. And against not a lot of competition, I mean, Antonio Banderas in Desperado, the Clive Barker adaptation, Lord of Illusions, followed the week after. Dangerous Minds was given the space to just hang around and help itself to a fair amount of money. In fact, by the start of September, it was back up to second place. Just kept off the top spot by To Wong Fu, Thanks for Everything, Julie Newmar. But still, it was around the top 3 for a surprising amount of time. That was the thing with Dangerous Minds. It just endured. Wouldn't drop out of the top 5 for nearly 2 months after its release. And by the time it was done in US cinemas, $84.9 million was seen as a really, really strong result. I mean, primarily because it was, but also it did nearly $100 million outside of the US, and this really modestly costed film had just turned in a really sizable profit for the Disney subsidiary. I think came out through Hollywood Pictures in the end. Total box office $179.5 million. Off the back of really quite rancid reviews and a degree of pushback as well. And you know what? In hindsight, Luann Johnson is fairly sanguine about it. And she says, I cry every time I see it. And she explained that I think it inspired a lot of people. She said, I can whine about the changes, but overall it had a good effect. Some young people got to become actors who might not otherwise have had a chance. There was, I mean, as much as it was a one-off, there was a spin-off TV series that would follow very, very briefly in 1997. It only ran for one season of 17 episodes. No Michelle Pfeiffer. In her place came Annie Potts of Ghostbusters fame. And it would do okay, but it would be fairly soon cancelled. And then John N. Smith, I mean, I just want to note that he would go on to do, his next project would star Vince Vaughn and Monica Potter, really underrated actor, I think, Monica Potter. It's called A Cool Dry Place, but that one kind of sank a little bit without Dre. Kept working, kept doing stuff, but nothing of the size really, and of the impact of Dangerous Minds. But then, of course, Dangerous Minds itself couldn't be said to have had the impact of its title song. Which brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thanks so much for listening and thank you for your time. Have I bored you completely? If I haven't, if by some miracle I haven't, then you can find more from me on Twitter and on Blue Sky at Simon Brew. You can find more from Film Stories on both of those services too at Film Stories. Facebook.com/Film Stories Online. You can find us on YouTube, youtube.com/Film Stories. We have a website, filmstories.co.uk. That is updated every weekday with movie news, reviews, features, games, television stuff as well. We're determined to build a clickbait and AI-free movie and entertainment website, which is really, really hard. It's really hard to get noticed. Again, thank you to everyone who's supporting us there. You can find our shop at store.filmstories.co.uk. That's where you can find our Blu-rays for sale there as well. We've got the UK exclusive Blu-rays that we've made in conjunction with our friends at Plumeria Pictures of No Way Out and of Bull Durham as well. And we've finally worked out how Instagram works as well. You can find us on Instagram at Film Stories Magazine UK. But for now, I think that's it, isn't it? I've completely outstayed my welcome, as always. The main thing is, you all look after yourselves. You all stay safe. You all take care. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, thank you so much for listening. Thank you for your time, and the very best to you all. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.